At 56 years old, Brett Favre is no longer the fearless quarterback the world once watched every Sunday. He is no longer standing in the middle of a roaring stadium, wearing that famous number 4 jersey, waving his arms, calling the play, and daring the defense to stop him. Today, the cheers are quieter, the cameras feel heavier, and the story surrounding Brett Favre has become far more painful than many fans ever expected. For decades, Favre was the picture of toughness. He was the quarterback who played through injuries, through pressure, through criticism, and even through personal heartbreak. He was wild, emotional, unpredictable, and unforgettable. Some quarterbacks played carefully. Brett Favre played like every snap might be his last. He threw passes other players would never attempt. He celebrated like a child. He suffered like a warrior. And somehow, that made people love him even more. But behind the legend was a body taking punishment year after year. Football fans saw the touchdowns. They saw the records. They saw the dramatic comebacks and the frozen nights at Lambeau Field. What they did not always see was the damage that slowly built up beneath the surface. Every hit, every sack, every collision, every moment when Favre got back up and smiled as if nothing had happened, those moments became part of the myth. But they may also have become part of the cost. Brett Favre's career began far from the glamour of NFL fame. Born in Mississippi, he grew up with a hard-nosed, country boy attitude that followed him his entire life. He was never polished in the traditional sense. He was not a perfect speaker, not a perfect decision-maker, and certainly not a perfect quarterback. But he had something that could not be coached. He had fire. He had nerve. He had the ability to make people believe that even when everything looked lost, one throw could change the game. When he arrived in Green Bay, few people knew he would become the face of a franchise. The Packers had history, but they needed a new heartbeat. Favre became that heartbeat. With his powerful arm, fearless style, and emotional personality, he helped bring Green Bay back to the center of the football world. He won MVP awards. He won a Super Bowl. He created memories that still live in the minds of fans who watched him in the 1990s and early 2000s. But greatness rarely comes without a price. Favre was praised for being almost indestructible. Game after game, season after season, he refused to sit down. His consecutive start streak became one of the most famous symbols of toughness in NFL history. To many fans, it proved that he was different from everyone else. If he was hurt, he played. If he was tired, he played. If the odds were against him, he played anyway. At the time, people called it heroic. Now, looking back, it feels more complicated. Because the same toughness that made Brett Favre a legend may have also helped hide the pain he was carrying. Former football players often speak about the years after the game as a second battle, one that begins after the cameras leave and the crowd stops chanting. The body remembers what the mind tries to ignore. Knees, shoulders, backs, and especially the brain can carry the silent history of a violent sport. For Favre, that reality became even more heartbreaking when he revealed that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Fans who once saw him as unstoppable suddenly had to face a painful truth. Even legends are human. The man who once stood tall under the brightest lights was now dealing with a condition that could affect movement, strength, and daily life in ways no football opponent ever could. And that is what makes his story so emotional. Brett Favre spent his career fighting visible enemies, defensive linemen, rival teams, impossible scoreboards, angry crowds. But this fight is different. Parkinson's disease is not an opponent he can outrun. It is not a blitz he can read before the snap. It is not a mistake he can erase with one miracle throw in the fourth quarter. It is a private, personal, and deeply human battle. For fans, the sadness comes from remembering who he was and seeing what he now must face. They remember the smile, the arm strength, the swagger, the way he could make a stadium explode with one impossible pass. They remember the emotional games, the dramatic wins, and the feeling that Brett Favre was never truly finished until the clock hit zero. But life does not always give people a final drive. Sometimes, life changes the game completely. And at 56, Brett Favre's story is no longer just about football greatness. It is about pain, aging, controversy, resilience, and the difficult truth that even the strongest men can be forced into battles they never chose. For a man like Brett Favre, silence may be one of the hardest things to accept. During his playing days, everything around him was noise. The roar of the crowd, the sound of helmets crashing, the voice of coaches shouting from the sideline, the pressure of millions of fans waiting for him to do something spectacular. Favre lived in that noise for years. He seemed built for it. When the stadium got louder, he looked more alive. When the situation became impossible, he seemed more dangerous. But retirement has a different sound. It is quieter, slower, less forgiving. When athletes leave the game, fans often imagine they step into a life of comfort, money, and celebration. And in many ways, Brett Favre earned a life that looked like that from the outside. He had fame, records, a Hall of Fame career, and a place in football history that very few players will ever touch. His name was already carved into the memory of the NFL. But what happens when the applause fades? That question has haunted many athletes after retirement. For Brett Favre, the transition was never just about leaving football. It was about leaving behind the identity that had defined almost every part of his adult life. For so long, he was not simply Brett. He was Brett Favre, the quarterback, the leader, the risk-taker, the man who could walk into a huddle and make everyone believe. Without the game, a man must face himself. And for Favre, that road has been filled with shadows. His career was never clean and perfect. That was part of his appeal. He threw too many interceptions. He trusted his arm too much. He made mistakes that drove coaches crazy and broke fans' hearts. But he also made plays that seemed impossible. People forgave the mistakes because the magic was worth it. That was the deal with Brett Favre. You accepted the chaos because at any moment it could become greatness. But life outside football does not work the same way. Mistakes do not disappear after the next touchdown. Controversies do not fade because of a fourth-quarter comeback. Public opinion does not reset after one brilliant performance. And in recent years, Favre has learned that the same fame that once protected him can also make every failure louder. The welfare fund controversy in Mississippi brought a painful new chapter to his public image. For many people, it was shocking to see Favre's name connected to allegations involving money that was supposed to help poor families. He has denied knowingly taking welfare money, and he has not been criminally charged. But the headlines still changed the way many people looked at him. For a man once celebrated as a symbol of grit and hometown values, the scrutiny was devastating. It created a different kind of tragedy. Not the tragedy of one single event, but the tragedy of a complicated legacy. Fans who loved him had to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. Can you admire the player and still question the man? Can childhood memories survive adult disappointment? Can a sports hero remain a hero when real life becomes messy? For some, Brett Favre will always be the quarterback who gave them the best Sundays of their lives. For others, his later controversies made it harder to celebrate him the same way. And for Favre himself, that split in public opinion must be a heavy burden to carry. Then came the health news. When Favre revealed his Parkinson's diagnosis, the conversation around him shifted again. Suddenly, the story was not only about scandal or legacy, it became about mortality. It became about the frightening reality of what years of violent football might leave behind. Fans who had criticized him still paused. Fans who had defended him felt a deeper sadness. Even people who were angry about the controversy could recognize the human pain of a man facing a serious disease. That is why Brett Favre's current chapter feels so heartbreaking. It is not simple enough to be pure sympathy. It is not simple enough to be pure judgment. It is a mixture of both. And that is what makes it feel real. Favre is a legend, but he is also flawed. He is a champion, but he is also a man under scrutiny. He brought joy to millions, but he has also faced serious public questions. And now, as he deals with Parkinson's disease, he is forced to confront a future no athlete can physically dominate. Football taught Brett Favre how to survive pressure, but this kind of pressure is different. There is no offensive line in front of him now, no receiver breaking open downfield, no crowd begging for one last miracle. Parkinson's is not a defense he can confuse with a pump fake. It does not care about his records, his Super Bowl ring, or his Hall of Fame jacket. It challenges him in private, in ordinary moments, in ways fans may never fully see. And that is where the sadness becomes deeper. Because the world remembers Brett Favre at full speed. We remember him sprinting onto the field, laughing, shouting, throwing his body into the game without hesitation. We remember the joy in his face after a touchdown. We remember the pain in his eyes after defeat. We remember a man who seemed to feel everything more intensely than anyone around him. Now, the image is different. At 56, Brett Favre stands as a reminder that legends age, bodies break, and reputations can become fragile. The man who once looked larger than life is now facing life in its most difficult form, uncertain, painful, and deeply human. But even in that sadness, there is something powerful. Because Brett Favre's story is not over. It has changed, yes. It has become darker, more complicated, and more emotional. But the same stubborn spirit that defined him on the field may still be part of him now. And for those who watched him for years, that is the part they hold on to. The hope that the man who spent his life getting back up still has one more fight left in him. To understand why Brett Favre's story feels so painful today, you have to understand what he meant to people at his peak. He was not just another star quarterback. He was the kind of player who made fans lean forward in their seats because nobody knew what would happen next. Not the defense, not the coaches, sometimes not even Favre himself. There was danger in the way he played, but there was also beauty. Every pass felt alive. Every game felt personal. He did not look like a man performing a job. He looked like a man throwing his entire soul into the game. That is why so many people connected with him. Brett Favre made football feel emotional. He laughed openly. He cried openly. He celebrated with teammates like a brother. He showed frustration when things went wrong. He was not cold or distant. He was raw. And in a sport that often asks men to hide pain, Favre seemed to turn pain into fuel. One of the most unforgettable moments of his career came after personal tragedy, when he played shortly after losing his father. Millions of fans watched as he delivered one of the most emotional performances of his life. It was not just about numbers on a stat sheet. It was about grief, pressure, love, and the strange way sports can become a stage for human sorrow. That night, even people who were not Packers fans understood why Brett Favre mattered. He made people feel something. But that same emotional connection is what makes the later chapters harder to accept. When a sports hero becomes part of your memory, you freeze them in time. You remember the young face, the strong arm, the fearless body. You remember the moments when they made you believe. And somewhere deep down, you expect them to remain that way forever. But no one does. Time does not care how many touchdowns a man threw. It does not care how many stadiums chanted his name. Slowly, quietly, it changes everyone. For Brett Favre, the change has been especially difficult because so much of his identity was built around physical courage. He was the quarterback who got hit and got up. He was the man who refused to miss games. He was the player who turned pain into proof of greatness. Now, pain means something else. It is not a sign of toughness anymore. It is a reminder of vulnerability. When Favre revealed that he had Parkinson's disease, it forced fans to look back at his career through a different lens. The hits that once seemed like badges of honor began to look more troubling. The injuries he played through, the collisions he shrugged off, the concussions he later spoke about, all of it became part of a larger conversation about what football demands from its heroes. For years, athletes were celebrated for ignoring their bodies. They were praised for hiding pain. They were called warriors when they kept playing through injuries. But later in life, many of them are left alone with the consequences. The crowd moves on. The league moves on. New stars arrive. New highlights fill the screen. But the old players still carry the impact. That is one of the quiet tragedies of Brett Favre. The public loved his toughness, but toughness cannot protect a man forever. It can carry him through a game, it can carry him through a season, it can even carry him through a legendary career. But it cannot stop time. It cannot erase damage. It cannot guarantee peace when the uniform comes off. And Favre's story becomes even more complicated because his personal struggles arrived alongside public controversy. That mixture has made it difficult for people to talk about him in simple terms. Some want to focus only on his illness and the sadness of seeing a legend face such a serious diagnosis. Others cannot ignore the questions surrounding the Mississippi welfare scandal and the damage it caused to his reputation. Both reactions exist at the same time. That is what makes this chapter feel so human. Brett Favre is not a movie character written to be perfectly heroic or perfectly villainous. He is a real person whose life contains triumph, pain, mistakes, pride, regret, and uncertainty. He gave football fans unforgettable memories, but he also became part of headlines that left many people disappointed and angry. For fans, that creates a painful conflict. They remember cheering for him. They remember defending him. They remember wearing his jersey, watching his games with family, and believing he represented something honest and strong. But now, some of those same fans look at his story and feel sadness mixed with confusion. They want to honor the memories, but they also know that real life is more complicated than a highlight reel. And maybe that is the most heartbreaking part of all. Brett Favre's legacy is no longer protected by the simplicity of nostalgia. It has entered the difficult territory where admiration and criticism stand side by side. The young quarterback in the green and gold jersey still exists in memory, but beside him now stands an older man facing illness, legal scrutiny, and the heavy weight of public judgment. At 56, Favre's tragedy is not only that he is battling Parkinson's disease, it is that the story of his life has become a reminder of how fragile greatness can be. One decade, a man can look untouchable. Another decade, he can be fighting to preserve his health, his name, and his peace. Yet even now, people still watch him closely. Not because they expect another touchdown, not because they expect another impossible comeback on a football field, but because some part of them still remembers the old Brett Favre, the man who refused to stay down. And in this new battle, quieter and far more personal, they are wondering whether that same spirit can carry him through once again. For Brett Favre, the hardest opponent was never one man standing across from him. It was always time. Time followed him from the beginning. It followed him through every snap, every season, every injury, and every comeback. When he was young, time seemed like something he could outrun. He played with the energy of a man who believed his arm would never weaken and his body would never betray him. He played like Sunday was the only thing that mattered. And for a while, the world believed it too. Fans did not watch Brett Favre because he was perfect. They watched him because he was alive in a way few athletes ever are. He turned football into drama. He could make a terrible mistake in one quarter and then create a miracle in the next. He could frustrate his coaches, terrify his fans, and break the hearts of opponents with the same reckless confidence. That was the strange power of Brett Favre. He made people believe in second chances. But life does not always offer second chances in the way football does. On the field, a bad throw could be followed by another drive. A painful hit could be followed by a touchdown. A loss could be answered the next Sunday. But away from the stadium, mistakes and suffering do not reset so easily. They stay, they follow, they become part of the story. And in Favre's case, the story has become heavier with every passing year. When people talk about his career, they often return to the image of toughness. They remember the consecutive starts, the fearless throws, the injuries he played through, and the way he seemed almost offended by the idea of sitting out. That toughness made him beloved. It made him legendary. It made him seem different from ordinary people. But now, that same image feels painful, because toughness can become a trap. When a man is praised for never showing weakness, he may begin to believe he has no right to be weak. When fans call him a warrior for ignoring pain, he may learn to ignore signals his body is desperately trying to send. When an entire culture cheers every time he gets back up, it becomes harder to ask whether getting back up was always the right thing to do. Brett Favre's health battle forces that uncomfortable question into the open. What did football take from him? It gave him fame, wealth, memories, and immortality in the minds of fans. It gave him a Super Bowl title and a Hall of Fame career. It gave him Sunday afternoons where millions of people waited for his next throw. But it may have also taken pieces of his body that cannot be returned. It may have taken peace. It may have taken years of comfort. It may have taken more than anyone understood at the time. That is not only Brett Favre's tragedy. It is a football tragedy, because his story represents something bigger than one player. It represents the difficult truth behind a sport built on collision. Fans love the violence when it looks controlled. They love the sound of the hit, the courage of the player who rises again, the drama of a man pushing through pain. But years later, when the same players struggle, the cheering becomes harder to remember without guilt. Favre once gave people the kind of excitement that made them forget the cost. Now, his life reminds them of it. And still, his story is not only about illness, it is also about reputation. Public memory can be cruel, especially to famous people who fall from the image fans created for them. For years, Brett Favre was seen by many as the tough, honest, small-town hero. He had flaws, but those flaws seemed connected to the field too aggressive, too emotional, too willing to take a risk. Then came controversies that could not be explained away with football language. Suddenly, the public was not debating interceptions or retirement rumors. They were debating character. They were asking what he knew, what he did, and what responsibility he carried. That kind of scrutiny changes everything. It can turn admiration into doubt. It can turn old memories into uncomfortable questions. For Favre, that public shift must have been devastating, because once a reputation cracks, it is difficult to make people see it the same way again. Even if some fans continue to defend him, others cannot separate the legend from the headlines. The result is a legacy caught between two worlds, the glory of what he achieved and the controversy of what followed. That is why his current chapter feels so heartbreaking. It is not a clean tragedy. It is not the story of a perfect hero struck by misfortune. It is the story of a complicated man facing complicated consequences. It is the story of someone who gave millions of people joy, yet now stands under the weight of illness, aging, public judgment, and personal uncertainty. At 56, Brett Favre no longer controls the story the way he once controlled a football game. He cannot call an audible and escape the past. He cannot throw deep and change the conversation. He cannot silence criticism with a touchdown. All he can do now is live through the consequences of a life that was bigger, louder, and more punishing than most people could imagine. And perhaps that is the saddest truth. The crowd remembers the hero at his strongest, but the man has to live with what strength cost him. There is something deeply painful about watching a man become a symbol before the world remembers he is human. Brett Favre spent much of his adult life being turned into something larger than himself. To Green Bay fans, he was not just a quarterback. He was the heartbeat of a city that lived and breathed football. To NFL fans, he was the wild gunslinger who made the game feel dangerous and beautiful at the same time. To young athletes, he was proof that confidence, toughness, and belief could carry a person further than anyone expected. But symbols do not get tired. People do. And Brett Favre, after all the records, all the applause, all the arguments, and all the collisions, is still a man. A man with a body that aged. A man with a mind that carried memories most fans will never understand. A man who made mistakes. A man who became famous for refusing to break, only to discover that life can break people in quieter ways. That is what makes his story so haunting today. When Favre was playing, pain was part of the performance. Fans expected it. Commentators praised it. The cameras loved it. A quarterback limping back to the huddle became a heroic image. A player shaking off a hit became a sign of courage. Favre mastered that image better than almost anyone. He looked like someone who could absorb punishment and turn it into energy. But years later, pain does not look heroic anymore. It looks lonely. There are no packed stadiums when a retired athlete wakes up feeling the weight of old injuries. There is no standing ovation when the body becomes harder to trust. There is no highlight reel for the mornings when simple movements feel different than they used to. The world remembers the glory, but the athlete lives with the aftermath. For Brett Favre, that aftermath now includes a Parkinson's diagnosis, and it has changed the emotional tone of his entire life story. Fans who once saw him as almost indestructible now see him facing a condition that does not care how tough he was. It does not care about Lambeau Field. It does not care about MVP trophies or Super Bowl memories. It simply becomes part of daily life, forcing a different kind of courage. This is not the courage of a last-minute drive. This is the courage of endurance. And that is a much quieter kind of bravery. At the same time, Favre's tragedy cannot be separated from the controversy that surrounded his later years. His name became tied to one of the most painful public scandals in Mississippi, a scandal involving funds meant for vulnerable families. Even though Favre has denied knowingly taking money intended for welfare recipients, the damage to his public image was real. For many people, the mere association was enough to change how they saw him. That kind of fall is difficult for any public figure. But for Favre, it was especially jarring because his image had been built around authenticity. He was the country boy, the tough competitor, the man who seemed unpolished, honest, and real. When controversy entered that image, it created a crack that nostalgia could not fully cover. And once nostalgia cracks, fans are forced to see the whole person. Not just the touchdowns, not just the jersey, not just the frozen field heroics. They see the contradictions. They see the human flaws. They see how easy it is to worship someone from a distance without really knowing them at all. Brett Favre's story forces that uncomfortable realization: the people we turn into heroes are still capable of disappointing us. And the people who disappoint us are still capable of suffering. That is a hard truth to hold. Some fans want the story to be simple. They want to remember only the young Favre, smiling through the cold, firing passes through impossible windows, celebrating with teammates after another unforgettable win. Others want to focus only on the controversy and the questions that remain around his post-football reputation. But real life rarely allows such clean divisions. Brett Favre is both memory and man. He is the quarterback who made millions cheer, and the public figure whose later years raised difficult questions. He is the fearless competitor who gave everything to football, and the aging former athlete now facing a neurological disease. He is a Hall of Famer, a controversial figure, a father, a husband, a Mississippi native, and a reminder that fame never protects anyone from pain. At 56, he stands in a strange place. Too young to be spoken of only as a distant legend, but old enough for the cost of the past to become impossible to ignore. Too famous to suffer privately, but too human to carry public judgment without consequence. Too celebrated to be forgotten, but too controversial to be remembered without debate. That is the tragedy of Brett Favre now. It is not one single heartbreak. It is the slow collision of glory, illness, regret, and reputation. It is the sound of a cheering crowd fading into silence. It is the image of a man who once controlled the chaos of football, now facing a chaos no playbook can solve. And maybe the hardest part is that fans still want one more comeback. They want to believe that the old Brett Favre is still there, somewhere stubborn, emotional, refusing to stay down. They want to imagine him fighting this chapter with the same fire he showed on the field. But this time, the fight is not for a trophy. It is for peace, dignity, health, and the chance to be seen not only as a legend, but as a flawed human being trying to survive the hardest season of his life. For many fans, Brett Favre will always live in a specific image. The cold air in Green Bay, the green and gold jersey, the helmet pulled low over his eyes, the quick smile before a dangerous throw, the way he ran toward teammates after a touchdown, full of emotion, full of life, full of that restless energy that made him impossible to ignore. That image is powerful because it feels frozen in time. But Brett Favre is not frozen in time. He has aged, he has changed, he has been tested by things much heavier than a football game. And at 56, the contrast between the man fans remember and the man facing life today has become almost heartbreaking to watch. There was a time when Favre seemed to belong to everyone. Packers fans claimed him as family. Football fans saw him as entertainment at its purest. Broadcasters built stories around his toughness. Children wore his jersey and tried to throw like him in backyards across America. He was not perfect, but his imperfections made him more compelling. He played the game with a kind of reckless honesty that felt rare. But fame is dangerous because it turns moments into myths. The real Brett Favre was always more complicated than the myth. The myth could throw a touchdown through impossible coverage. The myth could rise from the turf again and again. The myth could win, lose, laugh, cry, retire, return, and still remain larger than life. But the real man had to live inside that myth. He had to carry the expectations, the injuries, the pressure, and later, the criticism. That is a weight few people understand. After football, Favre entered a world where the rules were different. There were no practices to prepare for public judgment, no coaches to correct the mistakes, no game clock to end a painful chapter. The same confidence that once thrilled fans on the field could sound very different in real life. The same stubbornness that made him legendary could become a burden when he needed humility, patience, or silence. And that is where his story becomes sadder. Because many great athletes struggle not simply because they lose the game, but because they lose the structure that once gave their life meaning. For decades, Favre knew what he was supposed to do: prepare, compete, lead, win, recover, do it again. The rhythm was brutal, but it was familiar. Then suddenly, the rhythm stopped. The applause became memory. The body became a reminder. And the public, once so eager to celebrate him, became far more divided. When his name became involved in the Mississippi welfare controversy, it changed the way people discussed Brett Favre. No longer was the conversation only about football greatness. It became about responsibility, privilege, and trust. For people who once believed in the simple image of Favre as a hard-working, small-town hero, the headlines were painful. They forced fans to ask whether they had loved the man or merely the story built around him. That question still lingers. And then, as if his public life had not become difficult enough, came the health battle. Parkinson's disease brought a different kind of attention. Not the attention of scandal, but the attention of concern. It reminded people that behind the headlines and arguments was a person dealing with fear, uncertainty, and physical change. It is possible to hold both truths at once. A person can be accountable for controversy and still deserve compassion in illness. A person can have made mistakes and still be suffering. A person can be a beloved athlete, a criticized public figure, and a vulnerable human being all at the same time. That is what Brett Favre's life now forces people to confront. The tragedy is not only that he is sick, it is that his sickness comes at a time when his legacy is already under pressure. Instead of entering his later years surrounded only by celebration, he enters them surrounded by questions. Instead of being remembered simply as one of football's greatest competitors, he is remembered through a mix of admiration, disappointment, sympathy, and debate. For a man who once lived by clarity, win or lose, complete or incomplete, touchdown or interception, this must feel painfully uncertain. There is no final score for reputation. There is no easy statistic for redemption. There is no Hall of Fame speech that can erase every complicated chapter that comes after it. At 56, Brett Favre's life has become a reminder that greatness does not save anyone from consequence. The records remain. The Super Bowl memories remain. The unforgettable plays remain. But so do the injuries, the controversies, and the private fears that come with illness. And perhaps that is why people still watch his story so closely. Not because they want to see him fall further, not because they want another scandal, but because somewhere inside the sadness, there is still a human drama that feels familiar. Everyone, in some way, must face the gap between who they were and who they become. Everyone must live with choices. Everyone must watch time change their body, their reputation, and their place in the world. Brett Favre just has to do it in public. And that is a kind of tragedy most people will never know. As Brett Favre moves deeper into this difficult chapter of his life, the question many people quietly ask is not only what happened to him, but what his story means now. Because for years, his meaning seemed obvious. He was toughness. He was passion. He was the quarterback who played with his heart outside his chest. He was the man who made Green Bay believe again. He was the fearless gunslinger who could turn a broken play into a lifetime memory. His story once felt like a celebration of grit, talent, and refusal to quit. But now, the meaning has changed. Now, Brett Favre's story feels like a warning as much as a tribute. It warns us about the cost of turning athletes into machines. It warns us about cheering for pain before we understand what pain becomes years later. It warns us about confusing toughness with invincibility. And it warns us about the danger of building heroes so high that when they fall, the fall feels unbearable to watch. Favre's career was filled with moments that seemed almost impossible. The long throws, the frozen field victories, the emotional games, the streak that made him look unbreakable. For fans, those moments became part of their own lives. People remember where they were when he won big games. They remember watching him with fathers, brothers, sons, and friends. They remember the feeling of believing that no game was over while Brett Favre still had the ball. That is the beautiful part of sports. It gives strangers shared memories. But the painful part is that fans often move on while the athlete continues to carry the cost. The crowd can re-watch the highlights forever, but the player has to live inside the body that created them. The cheers fade, the records settle into history, the jerseys hang in closets, and the man behind the legend wakes up to a future that may look nothing like the one fans imagined for him. For Brett Favre, that future now includes illness. Parkinson's disease has changed how people see him, not because it erases anything he did, but because it makes his vulnerability impossible to ignore. A man who was once defined by movement, power, instinct, and reaction now faces a disease that challenges the body in ways that can feel deeply personal. It is a cruel contrast. The quarterback, who once controlled chaos with his arm, now faces a kind of chaos inside himself. And yet, that is not the only battle. There is also the battle over memory. How will Brett Favre be remembered? As the Super Bowl champion? As the record-setting quarterback? As the flawed public figure tied to controversy? As the aging athlete confronting disease? The answer may be all of these at once. And maybe that is what makes his story so difficult to package neatly. People like simple endings. They like heroes who remain heroes, villains who remain villains, and tragedies that come with clear lessons. But Brett Favre's life does not offer that kind of simplicity. His story contains greatness and disappointment, joy and pain, admiration and criticism. It contains the image of a man lifting a trophy, and the image of a man facing questions he cannot escape. It contains both the roar of the stadium and the silence of personal struggle. That is why his tragedy feels so real. Because real lives are rarely clean. At 56, Favre is not just fighting for health, he is fighting for dignity. He is fighting for the right to be seen as more than one headline, more than one mistake, more than one diagnosis, and more than one memory. But that fight is not easy when the public has already formed its opinions. Fame gives a person a platform, but it also takes away privacy. Once the world feels it owns your story, it rarely gives it back. And still, there is something powerful in the fact that people care. Even those who criticize Favre recognize that his life has become a deeply human drama. Even those who feel disappointed by him can understand the sadness of watching a former athlete confront serious illness. Even those who believe his legacy should be questioned may still feel the emotional weight of seeing a once dominant figure face vulnerability. That is not hypocrisy. That is humanity. We can remember the joy he gave fans while still acknowledging the controversies. We can feel compassion for his illness while still believing public figures should answer serious questions. We can mourn what football may have cost him without pretending the rest of the story does not matter. That balance is hard, but it is honest. And perhaps honesty is what Brett Favre's story needs now more than blind worship. He does not need to be turned back into a perfect hero. He was never perfect. He does not need every flaw erased. Life does not work that way. What his story demands is a fuller understanding of the man behind the myth. A man who thrilled millions, made mistakes, suffered consequences, and now faces a future filled with uncertainty. In the end, Brett Favre's tragedy is not that he lost a game. It is that the game he gave everything to could never protect him from life afterward. It could not protect his body from aging. It could not protect his reputation from controversy. It could not protect his peace from public judgment. And it could not protect him from the quiet fear that comes when the strongest version of yourself exists mostly in memory. At 56, Brett Favre remains unforgettable. But now, he is unforgettable for a different reason. Not only because of what he did on the field, but because of what his life reveals off it. That legends are not made of stone, toughness has a cost, and even the loudest cheers cannot save a man from the battles he must face alone.